All right. Hello, everyone. This is part 2 of our chapter 8 lecture, which is rather lengthy. I had covered up to sodium imbalances, right? So talking about hypernatremia and hyponatremia. Now for this part of the lecture, I'm just going to finish talking about all of the other electrolytes that we have sort of mentioned. And so the first one I'm going to talk about is chloride, right? So chloride imbalances. All right. So in terms of, just chloride imbalances, or just in terms of kind of function of chloride itself, right? It's an anion, meaning it's negatively charged, right? And it is the primary anion in the extracellular fluid, okay? So normal concentration is listed here. It is involved in maintaining extracellular fluid osmolality, as I said, because it is the primary negatively charged ion that exists in the extracellular fluid. Also, it is involved in acid-base regulation, as most of these ions are. It's inversely related to the concentration of bicarbonate. Makes kind of sense because that's another negatively charged anion. And again, I guess I don't even go there, but just understand that again, you're going to see this a couple more times where it says it's involved in acid-base regulation. And I sort of set that up at the beginning of the chapter because I told you we weren't really going to cover that whole chapter or cover that chapter on acid-base regulation. We just want to understand that these electrolytes are involved in that as well. It is also a component of hydrochloric acid in the stomach, right? So in the stomach, super acidic environment, chloride, HCl is hydrochloric acid. Also, it is essential for carbon dioxide transport in red blood cells. Okay, so, you can see that it's super important, just like all of these electrolytes. I just want to say with one thing that I think is important, because again, this can get a little tedious in terms of the symptoms, signs and symptoms that we kind of see for each one of these imbalances, right? And there's obviously a lot that we're talking about. I would say that one thing that you want to really focus on is just knowing what the function of each one of these is, right? So that first slide where I introduced that ion, like this one right here, I think is important. So I'll do that for each one to tell you, okay, what is this ion particularly important for, right? In terms of functions, all right? So I would expect that you know that, okay? There is some overlap, but you'll see that each one of them sort of has a unique function. Okay, so now we're going to talk about, well, what happens if you have too much chloride, right? So obviously hyperchloremia, right? Abnormally high plasma concentration of chloride ions. What are some of the causes? Metabolic acidosis. So again, we defined metabolic acidosis earlier on in the lecture. And so if there's something that's causing metabolic acidosis, it's also going to lead to hyperchloremia, okay? An increased concentration of chloride ions. Also, just water loss and dehydration will also lead to hyperchloremia. A head injury, right? A traumatic brain injury or head injury that leads to endocrine abnormalities can affect chloride levels as well. Also, often you see hyperchloremia with hypernatremia, right? So if you have increased sodium levels, you often also see increased chloride levels. Okay, again, remember that both of these ions are present in the extracellular fluid. Okay, so they influence one another. So severe diarrhea, respiratory alkalosis could also lead to hyperchloremia. Okay, and again, in terms of clinical manifestations, a lot of the clinical manifestations are similar to what you see in hypernatremia, okay? And a lot of the symptoms are related to dehydration. Okay, so in terms of diagnosis, right, obviously, if you see an increase in serum chloride, that's going to indicate hyperchloremia. Again, if the patient has metabolic acidosis or respiratory alkalosis, then most likely their chloride levels are increased as well, as I said before. In terms of treatment, right, IV hypotonic fluids, right? So remember what we mean by isotonic, hypotonic, or hypertonic. We went over that in part 1 of this chapter's lecture as well. Lactated ringers sodium bicarbonate if there's also an acid-base imbalance, because we did say that chloride was involved in maintaining, the proper pH of the blood. Also, you can use diuretics, which also, if there's that, you also have that hypernatremia as well. Diuretics, what do diuretics do? They basically cause you to urinate more, right? And so they're going to get rid of, it's going to kind of promote the excretion of urine. And then obviously also restricting sodium and chloride in the diet can help bring down these levels as well. I think if you check my notes on this slide, there's a little information on what Ringer's lactate solution is, right? It's a mixture of sodium chloride, sodium lactate, potassium chloride, and calcium chloride in water, okay? And again, it's used, it says here, used for replacing fluids and electrolytes, obviously, okay? So again, what you're going to give in terms of an IV fluid is dependent on, what electrolytes are missing, what, the fluid levels are. And so important to be able to, just get the labs to really look at all those levels. Okay. All right. Now, if we're talking about too little chloride, okay, some of the causes of this: vomiting, diarrhea, also nasogastric suctioning, right? Like stomach pump, right? If you had to get your stomach pumped because of some ingestion of some toxin or something like that, it can actually lead to hypochloremia as well. Also, alkalosis, burns, diuretics, and also, imbalances of certain hormones can lead to an increase in chloride. Okay, just to finish off with chloride here. So on the left-hand side, just some listing here of signs and symptoms of chloride imbalances. And particularly the signs and symptoms of chloride imbalances that's listed there at the top here is referring to this table, right? Which is showing you both hyperchloremia and hypochloremia. I already listed some of the symptoms of hyperchloremia in a couple slides ago. Here is listed the some clinical manifestations of hypochloremia, okay? So again, resembles hyponatremia, okay? So the symptoms for chloride imbalances and sodium imbalances are similar. Remember, again, both of them are predominantly present in the extracellular fluid, and they really do affect one another, okay? Cerebral edema is another symptom you might see. And so, again, we talked about what edema is, and this is particularly cerebral edema, right? So essentially kind of it's not inside the brain tissue, but sitting on top, and kind of in between the meninges or whatever. But regardless, it's an issue, because if you have edema, right, above kind of the cortex and in between the skull and in the brain, it then causes pressure to be pushed down on that brain tissue and can lead to obviously dysfunction. Also, headache, weakness, nausea, tetany, those are also symptoms as well. So tetany, you'll see this come up a couple times here, is basically just random why am I not able to define that? I have it defined on a subsequent slide, but so involuntary, that's the word I was looking for, right? Involuntary muscle contraction. So it's also here. I think I define it on a later slide as well, but you'll see that symptom comes up a couple times too, right? So involuntary muscle contractions. All right. So again, diagnosis, you're going to see that there's decreased serum chloride levels, right? And again, you can see kind of, what we mean if we're saying hypochloremia, right? It's below 97. If we're saying greater than 107, that's hyperchloremia. Okay, treatment, isotonic saline or hypertonic saline, replacement with oral sodium chloride. Okay, simple as that. It's just giving a salt supplement. Okay, and again, take a look at this table where it compares hyperchloremia versus hypochloremia. Okay. All right, so we'll move on to the next one, and the next one is potassium. Okay. Again, this first slide I think is pretty important for each one of these ions because it basically just explains the general function of that ion, okay? It tells you what the normal concentrations are. For potassium, remember that it says here, it regulates ICF, intracellular, right, fluid osmolality. So this there is lots of potassium inside the cell. Just like we said, there's lots of sodium outside the cell in the extracellular fluid. There is a lot of potassium inside the cell. Potassium is the primary ion that is involved in maintaining resting membrane potential, right? So every cell has a certain resting membrane potential. It's essentially the charge across the membrane. And that's super important. It's even more important in cells that will generate action potential, but it's important in every cell. And basically the cell can kind of tap into it as an energy source. And so it has lots of important functions. So if that resting membrane potential is not maintained properly, it leads to dysfunction of the cell. It is the essential component, obviously, of the sodium-potassium pump. Again, the sodium-potassium pump is primarily responsible for maintaining resting membrane potential. Okay, so really potassium plays a major role in maintaining resting membrane potential. It is also part of the buffering mechanism of the blood. When we say something is a buffer, or we talk about the buffering mechanism of the blood, that's the mechanism that's going to maintain that blood pH at about 7.4 where it should be. Okay, so again, imbalances in potassium are going to interfere with the pH of the blood. Okay, it's also involved in facilitating glycogen storage. Okay, and so basically, what's glycogen? It's carbohydrate storage in your cells, right? Predominantly in liver cells and in muscle cells. And when the body needs energy, right? It basically can break down the glycogen into glucose and then break that glucose further down to generate ATP. Okay, so it's involved in sort of energy storage as well. So you can see there are a lot of important roles for potassium. I mean, you guys can see that there's a lot of important roles for all of these ions that we're talking about. Okay, what this is showing you, this figure 811 here, is just really showing you, so renal regulation of sodium and potassium balance. So we talked about aldosterone before. I think I had another figure when we were talking about sodium, right? Here, if you look at the top, this is showing you, all right, what's going to happen if we have a decrease in sodium levels, or an increase in potassium. Okay, so predominantly here, we're focusing on potassium because we're talking about potassium, right? So if there is an increase in potassium levels in the blood, that will basically signal the adrenal gland. Well, it's going to go to the hypothalamus first, right? Hypothalamus essentially, it eventually is going to activate this adrenal gland. Well, hypothalamus, pituitary, right? It's going to activate this adrenal gland to eventually release aldosterone. Okay, aldosterone's effects are on the kidney, and what it does is it basically causes sodium reabsorption, right, to increase sodium, but it also causes an increase in potassium secretion, right? So when we say secretion, when we're talking about the kidney and we say secretion, that means more potassium will end up in the urine, right, and be excreted out. Okay, so if you're increasing potassium excretion, right, then you're taking potassium out of the body and then therefore decreasing potassium levels. Okay, so aldosterone's effect on potassium is shown here, but aldosterone's effect on both sodium and potassium is shown here. Okay, all right. So let's talk about what happens when you have too much potassium, right? So hyperkalemia. So some causes could be just oversupplementation, right? Of even just with potassium being in a multivitamin or other type of supplement like that. Renal failure obviously can lead to hyperkalemia as well. Endocrine abnormalities, I just showed you kind of one hormone that's involved in regulating potassium levels. There are other ones as well. And so if you have some sort of disease that's going to affect some of these hormones that I've sort of mentioned, it can then lead to hyperkalemia as well. Also, if you're taking diuretics, there are diuretics that their mechanism doesn't involve potassium, right? So this is a specific type of diuretic. Again, what does a diuretic do? It increases urinary output. But if this is a diuretic that doesn't really affect or cause potassium to be excreted, you can actually raise those potassium levels. Some of the clinical manifestations: muscle weakness, paralysis, dysarrhythmias. Again, this is abnormal heart rhythm, okay? And you would see a dysarrhythmia on an ECG or an EKG. Central nervous system effects as well, because remember we said that the potassium is really important in maintaining membrane potential. So yes, that affects every single cell in the body, but particularly is going to affect muscle cells and nervous system cells, right? Or neurons. Okay. And so that's why you see some muscle, you see muscle effects and central nervous system effects here. Okay. In terms of diagnosis, pretty much the diagnosis for all of these is the same. I hope you've sort of kind of noticed that, right? You have an increase in serum potassium, elevated I mentioned this before, this urea levels and creatinine levels. So again, those are kind of measures of kind of overall, right, osmolality, okay? And then also ECG or EKG abnormalities, like I just mentioned, okay? So if there's an abnormal heart rhythm or something like that, or some other abnormality in the ECG, it indicates that maybe there's an issue with potassium, okay? Because again, it's going to be particularly important in those types of functions. Treatment, there is a drug here called sodium polystyrene sulfonate, and it works by enhancing GI loss of potassium through increased stool excretion. So this isn't working on the kidney, this is actually working in the GI tract to basically induce your body to get rid of more of that potassium. Hemodialysis, also if the diuretic that's being used, right? Often, again, diuretics are prescribed for, congestive heart failure and other types of sort of fluid retention that occur and edema. Maybe you have to change that diuretic medication, right? If it's altering these potassium levels, then often you're going to have to change to a different diuretic that uses a different mechanism, okay? Another treatment here, IV calcium gluconate, right, or gluconate. This is given to counteract those lethal cardiac effects. If the imbalance of potassium is great enough, or there's enough, in terms of those levels of potassium, if they are increased enough, it can lead to lethal cardiac effects because of these dysarrhythmias that it causes, okay? All right, for hypokalemia, abnormal low plasma concentration, obviously. What are some causes? Decreased potassium intake, right? GI loss through suctioning. So remember we talked about like a stomach pump, that here as well. Fluid overload, which could potentially be true for any of these ions, I guess. Again, diuretics, excessive use of laxatives can also lead to hypokalemia. Hyperaldosteronism. So remember I just showed you over here that aldosterone, its action or its function is, in terms of potassium, is to cause more potassium to be excreted. So if you have too much aldosterone being produced, then you would have too much potassium being excreted, and your levels of potassium would be low, thus hypokalemia, okay? In terms of clinical manifestations, elevated blood sugar and serum cortisol in Cushing's disease. So Cushing's disease will cause basically an increased production of hormones that are released from the adrenal glands like aldosterone and others as well. And so because of that, right, it also causes an increase in cortisol. And so because of that, you're going to have blood sugar elevations and other types of abnormalities as well. But it also will affect potassium levels. Okay. In terms of diagnosis, again, decreased levels, right? Elevated urea, creatinine levels in heart or renal failure. So if the patient is at that point, you're going to see elevated levels of creatinine levels and urea levels. Electrocardiogram abnormalities, again. So whether if potassium is too low or too high, it's going to affect that electrical conductivity of those cardiac muscle cells, right? And basically lead to dysarrhythmias and other abnormalities, okay? So it's really, really dangerous to have an imbalance of potassium. Sorry, calcium I think is next. In terms of treatment, oral potassium supplements, also there are IV potassium supplements that can be given. By the way, guys, I'm kind of listing diagnosis here. I don't know. I guess I'm not going to I don't expect you guys to memorize all these different diagnoses. I mean, I think they are pretty much similar. I mean, it's obvious that you would you can check levels of these ions, right? And that's going to lead to diagnosis. You know, for things like potassium, the ECG is particularly important because it does affect that electrical activity of the heart. Okay. But in terms of these BNP and BUN and creatinine, I didn't really talk that much about them, so don't worry about it too much. But remember, those are kind of general sort of indicators of an electrolyte imbalance. Okay. And they're not really specific to these specific ions. Okay. All right. Anyway, if you look at this table here, right, we got hyperkalemia on the left and hypokalemia on the right. And again, you can, I'm sure you notice even by looking at this table, imbalances of potassium are dangerous, right? And there are a lot of effects that are caused by them, okay? And more serious effects probably than you saw with some of the other ones, okay? So just so you know, and again, they're going to be muscle, right? A lot of muscle effects, okay? And so if you look at hyperkalemia there, right, the big issue are the effects on the heart, okay? Also showing you bradycardia, heart blocks, cardiac arrest, right? Anxiety, tingling, numbness, muscle weakness, okay? So take a look at these and be familiar. Again, the big thing with potassium are the changes in the ECG and the changes of the electrical activity of the heart, okay? That are particularly important to note. Okay, so again, if you look, both hyperkalemia and hypokalemia can lead to cardiac arrest. Okay. All right. Moving on to calcium. I told you calcium was next. Okay, so for a little intro in terms of calcium, right, and why it's important. So we probably all know calcium's found in our bones, right, and our teeth. It is essential for those bones to keep the strength of those bones, right? It's also essential for blood coagulation, okay? It's also essential for muscular contraction, okay? It says cellular electrophysiology and membrane potential, also involved in that as well. That coincides with muscular contraction, also with nerve cell or neuron function, okay? It is essential, essentially, if you think about neurons or neurotransmitters, it's essential for release of a neurotransmitter, right? So if you don't have calcium around, or there's a decrease in the level of calcium, it's going to lead to a decrease in the amount of neurotransmitters that can be released. So bottom line is a calcium imbalance will affect the function of the neurotransmitters, okay? Also says here it acts as a second messenger, okay? So once a neurotransmitter or a hormone binds to its target cell, it activates a sort of cascade of events in that target cell. And oftentimes calcium is a messenger in that pathway, okay? So it's important for eliciting sort of effects of hormones and neurotransmitters as well, okay? So again, you can see, super important, right? Again, super important for muscle cells, for neurons, also in terms of bone, right? In the strength of the bone, important there as well. Okay, right, so I already wrote that down. That was me sort of explaining what's on this last bullet point here, okay? All right, let's talk about what happens if you have too much calcium, okay? Some of the causes of this, malignancy, so cancers can actually cause hypercalcemia, hyperparathyroidism. I have a figure on the next slide that I'll show you and explain that a little bit more, but basically it's an increase in parathyroid hormone, okay? If you're immobile, right, for whatever reason you can't move around a lot, it leads to bone loss, okay? When bone gets broken down, the calcium from the bone gets released into the blood, okay? So you need some calcium in your blood, but you also need some in your bone as well. There are a particular class of diuretics that causes an increase in blood calcium levels, okay? So if you're on that type of diuretic, it can cause that an increase. Just excessive ingestion of calcium and or vitamin D, that can be an issue as well. Remember, vitamin D is necessary for your body to be able to basically take in calcium, okay? Or to be able to take calcium into, did I put notes there? Yeah, for calcium to be absorbed or taken taken in from the GI tract, essentially. Clinical manifestations, right? Decreased excitability of muscles and nerves. I just explained to you on that slide before that calcium is necessary really for a muscle contraction, okay? There's no calcium, there's no muscle contraction, okay? Also, particularly important in neurons in terms of the function of neurotransmitters and things like that, okay? Neurotransmitter release, but also other functions related to neurotransmitters. Can lead to fatigue, weakness, lethargy, okay? All right, in terms of diagnosis, again, elevated serum calcium, obviously, also elevated parathyroid hormone, elevated vitamin D. These all indicate hypercalcemia. In terms of treatment, intramuscular calcitonin. Again, on the next slide, I'll explain calcitonin and parathyroid hormone a little bit more. IV fluids, okay, and these IV fluids would serve to dilute that serum calcium, right, by basically enhancing excretion of it, okay? So this is just a picture that I had kind of added in. It's not a figure that's from your textbook, but I think it's worth it. I think it's probably just from a anatomy and physiology textbook, but super kind of simple here because I mentioned calcitonin, I mentioned parathyroid hormone. So if you look here at blood calcium levels, right, homeostasis, you got to maintain this certain blood calcium level. If that calcium level in the blood raises too high, then the thyroid gland will release calcitonin, okay? So calcitonin, its function is basically to bring calcium out of the blood into the bone, okay? So it pulls that calcium out of the blood and puts it into the bone, and it essentially can be stored there. If your blood calcium levels drop too low, one of the hormone that will be released and produced is parathyroid hormone, and it's on the parathyroid gland, from the parathyroid glands that basically sit right on the thyroid gland. And parathyroid hormone will actually, and I have another picture, I think that's a little bit more, well, I'll talk a little bit more specific in a second, but basically parathyroid hormone leads to an increase in blood calcium levels, okay? So calcitonin, if you give calcitonin, the reason why you might give calcitonin, right, for hypercalcemia is because calcitonin will decrease blood calcium levels, right? So like I said, I have a little more detail on sort of this mechanism in a slide or two. All right. So what happens if we have too little calcium? Okay. Some causes hypoparathyroidism. So you don't have enough parathyroid hormone being produced. Hypomagnesemia. So too little magnesium, too much phosphate. Okay. And we'll talk about those. Those are the last two that we're going to talk about. Vitamin D deficiency. Okay. Because again, you need vitamin D to absorb calcium from that GI tract. So if vitamin D is not around, you're not going to be able to take in calcium, okay? Renal failure. Some clinical manifestations, central nervous system and neuromuscular excitability. Again, I explained that kind of on the first slide. There are actually two sort of, clinical tests that you can do that would indicate that the patient might have hypocalcemia. One is called the Chvostek sign, okay? And here in this test, you can tap the facial nerve and it will elicit this abnormal twitch of the nose or lip, okay? So if you tap that facial nerve and you see this, it indicates that perhaps the calcium levels are too low. This Trousseau sign, here you actually can occlude the arterial blood flow with a blood pressure cuff, and it causes, again, this sort of abnormal contraction or movement of the arm. Also, you might see, ECG abnormalities as well, okay? Because again, we said calcium is super important in function of muscle cells, right? And neurons, okay? So it's going to affect that electrical conductivity of the heart as well. Okay, so here, this is just a little more detail. So similar to kind of that other figure, but I think gives you just a little more detail here. So, and this is particularly focusing on just the hypocalcemia part, okay? So if calcium levels drop too low in the blood, right, leads to release of parathyroid hormone, like I told you before. But what are the actual specific effects of parathyroid hormone? So parathyroid hormone can actually work at the bone and will activate or stimulate osteoclasts to basically break down bone and then it will cause release of calcium and phosphorus into the blood, right? So the bone, you have calcium and phosphorus stored in the bone. And so if blood levels drop too low, then the parathyroid hormone will induce that calcium and that phosphorus to be released from the bone by essentially activating these cells that will break down some of the bone, okay? Obviously, you don't want this to happen too much. So if you think about like osteoporosis, you have decreased calcium levels in your body. I just told you very good reasons why your body needs to have calcium in the blood, right? To function, those muscle cells and those neurons. And so if there's not enough calcium around, your body's going to break down bone to get it because it needs it, right? And then that's how those bones can become brittle, and it can lead to osteoporosis. Okay, so obviously this is a normal process here, but if the body has to do it too much and breaks down too much of the bone, that leads to obviously weakness and fractures and symptoms associated with osteoporosis. If you look here too, the parathyroid hormone also has effects on the intestine here, okay? So it's saying here it leads to increased calcium uptake by the intestine here, right? And remember I mentioned the vitamin D here, okay? It's going to sort of induce sort of this activation of vitamin D because you need vitamin D to be able to absorb that calcium from the intestine, okay? So you can see how this is kind of, a little complex. Also, parathyroid hormone, if you look at its effects on the kidney, will induce increased calcium reabsorption, right? So remember, it's going to induce the kidney to keep more calcium in because, again, blood calcium levels are low. So you don't want the body to be excreting calcium, right? It needs to keep as much in as you can. And so all three of these mechanisms that I just went through lead to a rise in blood calcium levels, okay? Also, by the way, so that I don't forget to say this, for the exam, for sure from this chapter, there'll be at least 2 figures that I'm going to put on there for the essays, right? And ask you questions about. So it's not about memorizing this. It's about understanding it, okay? So just like I just kind of went through this, maybe I'll have 1 or 2 case studies, but I may have just 1 case study and 3 questions where they're figures. And it could be a figure even from chapter 5 or 6 as well, okay? So I like to use those because, again, it's not about memorizing, but it lets me know if you really understand the mechanisms and what's going on, okay? All right, so in terms of diagnosis for hypocalcemia, right, and treatment, decreased total and ionized calcium levels. Again, also if there's hypomagnesemia, I can't say that, right? If you have low levels of magnesium and high levels of phosphate, that also indicates that you have decreased levels of calcium. Okay, treatment, IV calcium salts, vitamin D supplementation, because again, that's going to enhance the absorption of calcium from the GI tract, right? And also dietary management. Maybe this is a result of, not taking in or eating enough calcium, right? Again, similar table that we saw for all of these, hypercalcemia on the left and hypocalcemia on the right. Okay, again, some pretty serious sort of symptoms that can occur due to a calcium imbalance. All right, I think we got one more after this, guys. All right, so phosphorus. Okay, so what about phosphorus, right? It is a really important to the buffer system of the blood. So it acts as a buffer in acid-base regulation. So again, an ion or an electrolyte that is particularly important in maintaining the appropriate pH of the blood. It is also a component in bone, as you saw in that last figure, okay? It's also a component of ATP, right? So adenosine triphosphate has a phosphate group on it. So it has to be around in order to synthesize ATP. ATP is the energy source or energy currency of the cell, okay? It's also involved in glucose, fat, and protein metabolism, okay? Says here, maintains control of calcium and phosphate concentrations and vitamin D regulation, okay? So super important in maintaining calcium levels, right? And again, in interacting with vitamin D. Let me just see if I missed anything. I guess we're good, right? So this last bullet point here is kind of going along with, again, if you look at that figure where a couple slides ago where I explained the role of parathyroid hormone, this kind of fits in with that. I'll show you actually right here, right? So this phosphate is involved in this process here. And again, remember, right? Because when parathyroid hormone acts on the bone, right, and breaks down these osteoclasts, essentially break down the bone to release calcium, it also releases phosphorus too, okay? All right, what happens if you have too much phosphate, okay? So some causes of that: chronic renal failure, respiratory acidosis, metabolic acidosis, hypocalcemia. These will all can all cause an increase in phosphate, okay? Again, we said that, phosphate is plays a major role in maintaining the pH of the blood, okay? So if we're talking about respiratory acidosis or metabolic acidosis, right, these are conditions where the blood pH drops too low, okay? And so these will affect phosphate levels. Okay, clinical manifestations. So these clinical manifestations will correlate closely with hypocalcemia, okay? So they're sort of, right, I guess, kind of opposite each other. So the clinical manifestations you see with too little calcium will correlate with the clinical manifestations that you see when a patient has increased levels of phosphate, okay? Some of them tingling, spasms, etc. Okay, and I'm going to show you that table in a second anyway. In terms of diagnosis, elevated serum phosphorus levels, treatment, restriction of dietary phosphorus. If you talk about too little, okay, what are some causes for that? Malnutrition, alcohol withdrawal, heat stroke, respiratory alkalosis, okay? Again, clinical manifestations are going to correlate with hypercalcemia, okay? Diagnosis, decreased levels of phosphorus, and then treatment, you can basically give, supplements of phosphorus. Ooh, I didn't put in the table. Oh my goodness. I'm going to pause and put that in. Okay, so this, sorry, I added in this table just because it was the only one I was missing, right? So if we look at the signs and symptoms of phosphorus imbalances, right? Hyper and hypo, take a look at them here, okay? Again, you see some dysarrhythmias here with hyperphosphatemia, muscle weakness, okay? Hypophosphatemia, right? Bone pain, okay? Because we talked about phosphate and calcium and that they are present in bones. And so you're going to have effects on bone when you talk about calcium and phosphate. All right. Let's move on to the last one, which is magnesium. All right. So again, first slide I think is important here in terms of what the role of magnesium is, okay? So it's a cofactor in a lot of enzymatic reactions, okay? So when we think about metabolic reactions or enzymatic reactions that occur in the cell, it acts as a cofactor in many of them, okay? So super important to the function of enzymes in the cell. Also plays a role in ATP generation, DNA replication, mRNA production and translation, again, because it acts as a cofactor to many enzymatic reactions, okay? It also prevents potassium from exiting cardiac cells, okay? So it interacts with potassium. And so you may see some similar sort of symptoms in here with potassium because of its interaction with potassium. It can act as a smooth muscle relaxant and is also involved in maintaining the integrity of the neuromuscular junction, essentially. Okay. Oh, so I guess I put the table here. Not sure really why, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. I'm not going to move it now. Again, hypermagnesemia and hypomagnesemia. You can take a look at those signs and symptoms. Okay, what happens if you have too high levels or increased levels of magnesium? Okay, well, one of the major cause is renal failure. So I guess or hypermagnesemia is not, I guess, that common. Okay. And yes, that's true. For clinical manifestations, you would have increased urea and creatinine levels. Also, other electrolyte disturbances would be evident. So usually you wouldn't just see this alone. Often there's cardiac abnormalities, as I kind of pointed out when you looked here at that table, and also because it has that sort of relationship or interaction with potassium. Diagnosis, increased serum magnesium. Okay. Treatment, you need to stop any type of magnesium containing medication. So like I said, this isn't something that happens, is common, put it that way. If we talk about too little magnesium, okay, abnormally low plasma concentrations of magnesium, some of the causes are hypocalcemia and hypokalemia, okay? Again, you can see this sort of interaction between calcium and potassium. Decreased dietary intake of magnesium. So hypomagnesemia is more common than hyper, okay? Increased dietary intake or decreased dietary intake of magnesium or decreased absorption in the GI tract because of some of the other factor, I guess, that leads to that. Starvation would probably lead to a decrease in most of these electrolytes, right, or cause an imbalance. So clinical manifestations are actually similar to hypermagnesemia, okay? So again, if that magnesium imbalance is off, it's going to lead to sort of similar clinical signs and symptoms. Diagnosis, again, pretty obvious. And then in terms of treatment, dietary management, obviously if it's a starvation issue or there's an eating disorder or something like that that could be causing this, you would have to deal with those issues. And then obviously you could give magnesium supplements as well. All right, and that is the last one. So just to remind you that the signs and symptoms of hypermagnesemia and hypomagnesemia are listed here. Okay, again, you can see that there's dysarrhythmias with both hyper and hypo. And you can see there's, it's going to affect blood pressure as well. Okay. And so that's it, guys. I will stop talking. Make sure you have your review sheet out. You took notes on it. You're paying particular attention to the figures that I've presented here. And basic functions of these ions.